Alright, so our second class of the day is workshopping rituals in a world of spirits. And again, there's some of the stuff we cut out of the first class, which is also kind of practical related. So we might weave some of that in as well, but it sort of depends on what we go through here. I think a lot of times when we look at ritual design, we look at ritual design very much based on a particular mode or tradition or structure, and we have sort of forms that we try to model after, and we can try to work spirits into those forms, but it doesn't always work out. I think we can also look at some of the traditional ways that spirits have been worked with in European culture, and that those can work with some spirits but not others. And then we can look at the way spirits are worked with in other cultures, and that can also inform what we do without necessarily us doing the same thing that they do. We can find ways that work for our culture and work for the spirits that we're working with. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that go into figuring out what you're going to do ritually or what you're going to do magically in working with spirits, and then kind of talk a little bit specifically practically on what that should look like. So the first thing is your goal and formulating a goal. And I think this is something where, not just in magic, but pretty much all elements of our culture, it should be something that's taught as a really important thing. That should be the first step in most stuff, but it's not. And so, like, I work in finance and financial planning, and goal setting is an incredibly important element of that. Whenever you do any, like, certification or training on that, there's whole units and courses on the concept of a goal and how to set a goal. I have a client who is a youth mentor, and he does this whole huge goal setting thing with the youth that he mentors. I coach youth athletes, and when I talk with them about setting their short-term and their long-term goals, they look at me like I'm speaking some other language, because it's just not something that we focus on. But I tend to think that you're not going to have a high probability of success at something unless you have a clear goal that is understood. So when you are putting together that clear goal, though, the goal is not just what your end desire is. That's an important component of the goal. You have to know what the end desire is, and that end desire can't be vague. It can't be like, I want my life to be better. I'm like, that's not a goal. It's nice, but it's not a goal. You can't get there because you don't know what it means to be better at that point. So you have to have a clearly defined end desire, but you also have to know what things do you already have that will get you there. Like, do you have some of the parts of what your goal is already? The parts that you don't have that you have to achieve, what resources are already part of your life that you can use in order to accomplish that goal? And what do you have to do with those resources in order to get them to the point where that goal is accomplished? What adjustments do you have to make along the way of working towards that goal in order to make sure stuff stays on track? Like, what things could come into play that could change the way that your plan is set? What things could come into play that could derail meeting that goal with the resources you have to use and with the way that you plan to apply them? And how are you going to compensate for those things if they occur? So when you're creating a goal, the goal has to be that whole process map. It can't just be, I want the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's got to be, okay, there's a rainbow out there. That rainbow has a pot of gold, and that pot of gold is going to be this big and worth this much. So I need to figure out how to get to the rainbow. How do you follow the rainbow to the end of the rainbow? What resources I have to help me find the rainbow? And what do I have that I need to take with me in order to be able to carry that pot of gold back and then to turn it into something usable? So that's all part of your goal setting, whether you're dealing with magic or whether you're dealing with mundane goals. So when your better professional magicians and professional diviners, when they do a consultation, that's the first part of their consultation, is they sit there and they workshop a goal with you, or they workshop a question with you, so that it's something where excuse me, there's clarity, but you're also hitting on all the necessary components in order to really get something out of the interaction. If you go to a diviner and you're like, hey, what's up with my life? Maybe they're going to tell you about a bunch of things that aren't necessarily important to getting you where you want to go. If you're like, you go to a diviner and you're like, I want to go to school. How do I go to school? And so they talk with you, they go through, and there's ways that can get you into a school and you can get into a program. But say you want to be an engineer, and all the things the spirits are showing the diviner are how to put you into a lit major somewhere. Like it's not going to be what you want. So you have to like figure out what the actual thing you want is, what the things that are possible are, what the things that you've got that are already going to help you be there, and what you can leverage in order to get you closer to those things that you don't already have. If you're not doing that, then you're probably wasting your time with the divination you're doing, because you're not going to get information that's actionable. If you're not doing that, you can do magic towards something, but you're not necessarily going to get the full picture of the magic that you need to do. So when you're looking at things from a magical perspective, you look at what resources you have, and then you need to look at how magic can impact those resources. So if there's people that can help you along the way to a goal, do you do magic that influences how those people help you? If you have some of the tools that you need in order to build something, do you do magic to get the other tools? Do you do magic to make sure the tools that you have are going to work properly? You have to look at how the magic is going to impact the resources that you're working with in order to get done what you want to get done. You have to look at your optionality, or the idea that Jason describes as how enchantable your life is. What things are there in your life that make you open to receiving what it is that your goal is? What things are closed off that are going to prevent you from getting your goal? If you want to go on a trip around the world, and you're doing magic to go on a trip around the world, but you're incarcerated, being incarcerated is a pretty big roadblock to taking that trip around the world. So you have to look at whether or not you need to do magic in order to get rid of those roadblocks that are there. There may be some things that just your life isn't going to be able to draw into itself because of the way it's structured. So you've got to look at, do you do magic to change the way things are structured in your life in order to be more open to the things that you want to have happen? And then also, what are going to be the effects of those changes that you make aside from just making you more open? When you're looking at spirits, because those are one of the resources that you have in magic, is it going to be one spirit that accomplishes this goal, or is it going to be several? So, say you want to start a business, and you are starting from the ground up. You're going to need the resources to put together whatever it is your business is offering. You're going to need customers, which means you're going to need people to become aware of your business. And you're probably going to need connections with people in other businesses to help facilitating you getting the things that you need in order to accomplish whatever your business does, as well as facilitating you getting that awareness out for your business. And also to kind of navigate things as far as centers of influence versus competitors. So just in that goal, you've got, okay, maybe you can do all this with mercurial spirits, but you have mercurial spirits that you're going to want to call on for communication, because that's going to help you with the networking that you need. It's going to help you get your information out to your customers. You might have to call on solar spirits or lunar spirits as far as the way people think about your business or the way your business appears to people. You could call on solar spirits for establishing empire and beating out competition in your business, carving out an area where your business is the business that does the thing that you do. You might call on Jupiterian spirits for making sure that you have the materials that you need in order to produce whatever your business is producing. Jupiterian. Yeah. So it may not be one spirit or one type of spirit that's doing the things that you need to do for your business. And depending on the types of spirits you're working with, or the system you're working with, spirits might not be planetary. I'm just using planetary examples because it's an easy language to use. And then if you're calling on multiple spirits to go out and work on different parts of your goal, then are you calling on them all at once, or are you calling on them separately? Are they all getting the same instructions? Do they all understand the same things about the goal? And even if they do, are they all going to look at the goal in the same way and be able to work together? Or is it possible that they might work in ways that conflict with one another? So then do you need to have some spirit you're working with who coordinates the rest of the spirits and how the work is being done? So those are things in terms of how you look at what your resources are and how you're going to look at your how you're applying them. We talked about divination a little bit already. So divination is something that you can use to help clarify what issues might impact the goal. So if there are things where you're not necessarily projecting out future problems that you might need to make adjustments for, but where you're trying to understand what your current optionality is and whether or not there's room in your life for this goal to manifest, divination can help with telling you about that. If you think that the thing that you want is one thing, but you're not sure, and you're not sure about what will happen if you get that thing, and whether or not that's really going to lead you where you want to be, then that's something where you would use divination to try to figure out, is this the thing you need, or is this the thing you want, or is there some other variant of this thing that would make more sense for you? Divination can also answer which spirits you should involve. And that's not even what the note says, but it's true. So if sometimes I'll run into goals where it's like I'm working with my ancestors and I'm talking with them about what my problem is and what I need to do, and then the ancestors will be like, okay, go talk to this spirit. You've worked with this spirit before. They do that thing. Why don't you conjure that spirit? Or, okay, why don't you get this book of spirits that you have and go through that book while you're working with us, and we can help you divine out which spirit you should be calling on in order to accomplish this goal. So your divination can be to figure out who you should be working with. But when you're doing this divination, you don't want to do your divination where you're just saying like, okay, let me toss out some tarot cards and see what's up, or I'm just going to move this pendulum around. Your divination should be a way of communicating with the spirits that you work with on a regular basis. So if your go-to spirits are your ancestors, you should be doing your divination with your ancestors. If there's an angel that connects with the particular thing you're working on, then go to that angel. If there's not necessarily a spirit that connects to the thing that you're working on that you work with regularly, look at your birth chart and look at what planets are connected to the house that rules over the thing that you're dealing with, and then call the angel or call the spirits of that planet, because they're the ones that are going to deal with how that particular area of life manifests in your life specifically. So you might have something where it doesn't seem particularly Jupiterian, but Jupiter might be connected to the house that rules that thing. So you might call on a Jupiterian spirit because the way that that thing manifests in your life is going to have to do with Jupiter. If you have a particular saint or a member of the mighty dead that you work with, then that would be who you call for your divination. Your holy guardian angel would be another option. So you want to call on that spirit and have a way that that spirit is used to interacting with you through a particular tool of divination. Have a tool that you've dedicated to that spirit and work with it in a space that's dedicated to that spirit, so that that spirit can communicate through that divination tool and give you its insight into how to work with the rest of the spirit world on this goal and how that goal plays out in your life. Because if you're just kind of randomly divining without engaging someone that you're talking to, you're just sort of trying to pick up the currents of what the world around you is, and those may or may not be useful to your specific situation or the specific understanding that you're looking for. You can definitely get information that way, but it's going to be kind of information about what is, as opposed to an engaged, interactive experience with something conscious that can tell you more about what it's observing with what's going on. So then, once you've got your goal, where are you going to do your ritual? I mean, the obvious place is your bedroom, right? That's where people do rituals and live in small spaces where we don't have huge temples, we don't have places to go out to. And sometimes your bedroom works, but sometimes your bedroom's not the best place for that, because maybe you have a partner that's not a magician, and maybe they don't like that going on in the bedroom, and that creates anxiety for them. If you're dealing with things where you've got something that you're anxious about and you're doing magic for it, then you're now associating your sleeping space with thinking about that issue, and that's not necessarily a psychologically healthy thing either. You're blurring things into a space that should be your space to retreat away from things with active things that you're trying to deal with. Outside of that, from a spirit perspective, you're inviting a bunch of spirits into that space to hang out. And so if you have spirits that are enshrined, that there is some constant presence from that spirit because of the way they're enshrined, then they're always there chilling in your bedroom with whatever you're doing in your bedroom. And that may not be what you want, and they may not want to see everything you got going on. Aside from the fact that you probably aren't going to jerk off in front of your ancestor shrine, there's going to be some spirits that you're going to work with that you don't want to constantly be exposed to their natures. So if you can only work in the space of your bedroom, have a cabinet or an enclosure that the spirits can be enshrined in, so that you have a ritual space that you open up and you work in that ritual space to work with them, and you close it up when you're done working with them, so that they're not constantly in interaction with your space, you're not constantly in interaction with them. And I would say, like, it's going to matter more for some spirits and less for others, but really any spirit that you're dealing with where they have a particular nature. So if you're dealing with a spirit that, say you have a spirit that deals with love and lust and relationships that you deal with regularly, if that spirit's housed in your bedroom, then you're constantly in connection with those forces, and that's going to start to shape how you live your life. And you may not want to always have those forces be the forces you're channeling out into your life. If you have a spirit that has to do with war and vengeance, probably don't want that to be constantly the flow that's coming into your room while you're sleeping at night, and then you're going out channeling that energy back into the world around you. The magic you do regularly is going to be the magic that you sow into the world around you. So you probably want to do magic that's pretty varied and not just along one axis all the time. But you're still probably going to have like a main couple spirits that you deal with, and they're going to have like a main couple things that they deal with. And so if you're in constant exposure to that, that can get a little weird. So find places that you can house those spirits that are not necessarily the space you're always going to be in, or do it in a way where you can kind of make a separation between your space and their space, so that their space is there and open when you need it, and it's not when you don't need it. Yes?
Something they taught us to do in Wicca when you didn't have a lot of space was you would have temporary altars and break them down and then carefully wrap everything up and put it away in a little space, take it all out, put it in. So it was very much, seems to be the same sort of thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's so that in that case you don't have a spirit that's enshrined, so you don't have a spirit that's always present. So yeah, you kind of take down the stuff, put it away, you engage it when you want to engage it, and so it's a different sort of scenario, because there's not that constant presence of a thing, and you're not building up the sort of relationship that you have when there's that constant presence. When you have something that you can close off, you can still develop that sort of thing where it's housed there. It's like you're going to a temple of that spirit when you're dealing with it, because it's always living in that space. The other end of that, though, is you still run into issues where, if, say, you're doing a working for something over a period of a couple weeks and you're routinely working on something, you're still building up that energy and that nature in that space. And so you want that to be in a space where, like, you're not necessarily just dwelling in that nature all the time, because that's where you start to run into obsession with a particular sort of energy. So the other thing to do is, like, okay, maybe you do banishings and cleansings if the only option is you have the space where you primarily reside in. but then also you're dispersing the energy and the force that you're trying to work on at that point. So the point isn't don't work in your bedroom ever. The point is you want to maybe look outside the box and look at what the concerns are for different spaces that you have, because any space you're working in, there's going to be concerns for it. I was doing a sweetening jar a couple days ago, and I wasn't going to be around while the candle was burning, and so I did it on my bathroom sink because I wanted it, if it fell over, it would fall into a place that was not going to be a fire hazard. And but then it was like the whole time it was like this space doesn't feel good for this. Like, yeah, so it's like I've got like my laundry basket sitting next to it. I've got like a pile of books on a drawer that's next to it, and it's like it's just what is this? Like and I'm like kind of cramming into this space, making sure it's like on the right part of the sink, that whichever direction it falls, if the candle falls, it's going to fall on sink and not on other things. And so it's like I'm not putting it in a space that feels ideal. And so I don't think that makes it so that the magic can't work, but it's miasma. It's something that distracts you from being able to work fully because you're concerned about something that's potentially detrimental, whether it's detrimental or not.
See, it gives me a question about I fight with all the time about ethics with spirits.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I have one I talked to since I'm very small, and I still debate with if it's rude to. I mean, I have a term I use for it. It's been around a couple times, but is it rude to find out like is that where is it appropriate to a ritual space? I have an individual I'm working with. Feel kind of rude not to put it in my room with my other friends.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, so the ethics. I mean, is there a method of? I've been trying to find the divination method of getting accurate methods of ethical interactions. Is there?
I think some of that is like, yeah, you have to do divination, you have to ask the spirit. Some of it's going to be looking at sort of cultural things that came before and how these spirits were interacted with before. But some of it's also going to be looking at your comfort zone and your needs as well. So, like, the spirit's going to have the things that are good for it and that it needs or that it wants, and they may or may not always be in line with what's good for you. And so sometimes that's a negotiation, and sometimes it's well, we just can't work together. So, like, if it's important to you to know the identity of the spirit, and that's a deal breaker, then you need to be able to ask. But if it's, yeah, so,
Is it disrespectful to the family?
right.
For me, that would be a respect issue. To be worried about kind of being offended, like, dude, this is the best you got for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be some spirits that are more concerned about things like that, and some that are not. And I think it's going to be your spirits that are, again, closer to our level of existence are going to be the ones where those are going to be bigger concerns, because they're familiar with these areas, they're familiar with what these different places are, and so they're going to be like, no, why are you talking to me in your bathroom? Like, whereas if you're talking to an angel, the angel's going to be like, are you living your best life? Yeah. So yes.
I'll briefly bring up the bathroom because there was a time period when we were sharing a house with someone else, and the only place it could work was when everyone was asleep in the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really nice big bathroom, but I would always start out with saying, I'm here because I can't do it anywhere else. And I never had a problem.
Yeah.
Everyone seemed to be cool with it.
No, I think most spirits aren't super concerned about things like that, as long as it's not something particularly offensive to the spirit. So like if you wouldn't want to work with like an animal spirit in a slaughterhouse, like something like that, where it's going to be particularly like yeah, this place is like clearly not good for this spirit. But I think other considerations of the space is, do you want to go to the spirit, or do you want the spirit to come to you? So is it a spirit you have a relationship with? So if you've got a relationship with the spirit, then you're probably in a situation where it's easy enough to invite the spirit to come to you. you're either going to know if there's certain places that the spirit's not going to want you to interact with it, or the spirit's going to be okay with you interacting with it in most places. If you don't have a relationship with the spirit, then maybe you want to look at going out to some place associated with the spirit to establish that relationship. And if so, is there a place that that spirit has a relationship with that's someplace that is accessible to you? So like if you're looking at the four kings are directional. So directions are sort of infinite. They're not actual places. But if you're thinking from your day-to-day life, when you think of going west, there's probably some place that you think of as, hey, that's a place that's off to the west. Or like, for example, say you want to talk to Oriens, and you're like, oh, this is the place that's east of my town, and you go to that place that's east of your town. So it's not necessarily the ultimate east or the ultimate west, but it's something that you associate with that direction. And whereas conversely, if you have something where there's a spirit that's tied to certain natural formations, is there a place in your community that has that natural formation? Is that unplugged?
Let me see. Maybe one of the power strips is not getting.
So, if there's some natural yes, that looks better. Thank you. If there's some natural formation that spirit's associated with, and it's not a spirit that you necessarily have a relationship with, you can go to that natural formation. If it's a spirit that's known for certain types of places, then maybe you go to that place. Like I recently established a relationship with Black Aggie by going to the Black Aggie grave, making offerings at the grave, requesting that we establish a contract, and asking for permission to take soil with me as a marker of that contract. And so Black Aggie's part of the spirits that are connected to my ancestor altar now. Yes.
I don't mean to be prying rude, having known the Black Aggie legend and everything, and being interested in it. I'm curious how that even came about as an idea.
So I actually work across the street from the Black Aggie Cemetery.
You're kidding me. Oh,
And
way cool.
you can't quite see the grave from my desk, but you can see the section of the cemetery that it's in, because the cemetery is huge. It's like 7 large cemeteries put together. And so when I realized it's like, okay, I'm trying to develop relationships with different local cemeteries, because you want to have relationships with local spirits, because they're going to be the ones that are more powerful to impact things around your life and around your area. And when you establish a relationship with a cemetery, my general understanding is you go and establish a general relationship with the spirits of that cemetery and its guardians, but also if there is either a particular spirit that is the oldest spirit there, or a particular spirit that is known to be like the key spirit of that cemetery, then you establish one specifically with that spirit as well. And I'm not very good at the planning part of this, so I don't think to connect with historical societies to find out whose grave is the oldest. But so it usually involves a lot of wandering around and looking at grave markers. But in this case, part of the legends of Black Aggie is that on certain nights of the year, all of the dead of the cemetery gather at that grave. And so Black Aggie is sort of like the ruler of that cemetery. So if I want to have a relationship with this huge cemetery, which is basically 7 cemeteries, I should have a relationship with that spirit. Now the other thing with Black Aggie is I didn't ask for a specific relationship with the actual deceased person at that grave. I asked for a relationship with the legendary spirit that's there, which I assume is some sort of nature spirit or local spirit that has connected with the dead there, and has sort of built these legends around itself. And when you look at nature spirits, as I mentioned earlier, when there's not a good relationship with them, all the stories about them are them being monsters. When there are good relationships, all the stories are about them being providers. And so, like an example, I'm not qualified to speak on Mamiwata, but that's one where you have some people that tell stories about really positive spirit interactions, and some stories that are like monstrous. And I think a lot of it has to do with when the stories develop, it's based on what the community's relationship with the spirit is at the time. And if the spirit feels that it's being dealt with well, it's going to provide for the community. If the spirit feels like it's being dealt with poorly, it's going to be antagonistic towards the community in order to defend the things that it's supposed to be protecting otherwise. And when you look around the world at different nature spirits, there's like this element where it's like they're these ferocious beasts, or they make sure you've got all your food and they make sure that the world's not destroying your community. But I think the stories, again, it's based on how the community is interacting. So in the United States, we don't have a good history for interacting with spirits. So all of our stories of local spirits are of monsters. You've got all of the your crybaby bridges, your weeping ladies, like, yeah, like the goat man. Like, none of them are things where you've got stories that are these like positive spirits that you're going to go interact with. They're these monstrous things. And I mean, there's probably a few here and there that are positive, but most of them are your things that are going to end up on an episode of Supernatural. And I think a lot of that is because we don't have a holistic way of dealing with these spiritual presences that are still there, and they feel like they're either abandoned or they're encroached upon, and so their only way of interacting with us is in a defensive manner.
But it's also because Christianity has specifically dictated that any spirit that is not God is necessarily demonic. So they've been treated that way.
The particularly Protestant Christianity, which is the defining Christianity for the United States.
I'll say one more thing, and then I have to use the necessary. But also, a lot of the stories involve stupid teenagers going out to be stupid. I mean, not
Yeah.
just make out. They're going to go out there and they're going to try and scare each other. And of course, if something's actually there, it's going to be like, why?
Yeah, it's
Here?
relatively
Why?
disrespectful. Yeah.
That's my
Most spirits understand making mischief fairly well. It's a pervasive meme in the British Isles.
But the spirits there are also still potentially dangerous. So,
True.
like you'll be fairy led if you go out and interact with them too much. So okay. So as we're looking at places to go in order to interact with spirits, if we're going to work in our own space, are there still spatial considerations? So one of the traditional elements of working with spirits is that spirits connect to particular directions. And so when you're calling a spirit, you might face that direction or you might stand in that direction. And when you're trying to figure out that direction, you can look at things like, is there a planetary connection to the spirit? Does the spirit move along one of the winds? Is the spirit zodiacal? And if it's zodiacal, then are you looking at a standard direction for that sign of the zodiac, or are you calling upon it based on the physical space that sign of the zodiac is in the sky at the moment? Or if you're dealing with a local spirit, is there some legend about that spirit that connects it to a particular place or a particular direction? Or is it a spirit that resides in a particular place, and maybe you would call it by looking in the direction that it resides in? Along with place, we want to think about time. So obviously, real magicians use planetary hours. That's how you calculate your time, right? Not necessarily, but that's sort of the starting point. But sometimes it's also where people stop. So there's a kind of a little bit of a smug modern magician I know who I don't think does magic, just magician in the sense that like they call themselves a magician, who once said like, well, if you can't be bothered to calculate planetary hours and do your ritual at a planetary hour, can you really call yourself a magician? And my feeling on that is, if you can't be bothered to understand zodiacal elections and all the other elements of timing that can occur in traditional magic, can you really bother to call yourself a magician? I don't think that's true. I think you can engage spirits generally when you need to. You don't always have to engage them based on certain timing, but it's going to be easier and sometimes more potent when you do.
But that brings up an interesting point. What is it that you can substitute, because sometimes you have to, and what is it that, no, it has to be exactly by tradition, by the book.
Right.
You can
And
give a lecture on that in the
yeah.
itself.
and there's a little bit of that we're gonna talk about. But I think with timing, I've had some cool things happen where stuff has happened that's like you need to call on this angel now if you're gonna do it, and then I go and I check like my planetary hours calculator, and it's like, oh, well, that planetary hour is about to start in like 5 minutes. I do need to do this now. Or where I'll call an angel and have like an offering in fire, and like the fire goes out at the end of the planetary hour, or you're not tracking the time of the ritual and the ritual wraps up, and then you look at the clock and like the planetary hour has just ended. So there does seem to be something when you get into a rhythm of interacting with spirits that operate on a planetary basis where the planetary hours are significant. When you look at certain texts, there's reason to think of the planetary hours as spirits themselves, or that there's a spirit that rules that particular hour and gives agency to those spirits that you would call in that hour. And so they have more ability to interact with the world during that time. Another way that people have explained the planetary hours, aside from them being something that has an innate spiritual nature to them, is that it's a way of reckoning time based on the movement of the deacons. But I've never seen anyone who's been able to like map out how exactly that would work as an alternative way of doing it that would look like the planetary hours. But there's a lot of different modes of timing to select from. So if you look at some of the grimoires, a lot of the demons are called based on church timing rather than based on planetary hours. So you have things like these spirits can be called during matins, these can be called during compline, and you have others have specific rituals you're supposed to do during certain parts of church timing. You've got the planetary hours, but then you also have zodiacal timing, where you can say, okay, there's this planet is in this decan, and so that has this nature to it, so I can call these spirits. Or there's this overall zodiacal election, which makes it good to call planets that are based, or spirits based on this planet. You can look at the mansions of the moon and look at different natures and powers that the mansions of the moon communicate, and you could tie that back to planets, or you could just say, like, okay, this mansion of the moon is good for travel, this spirit is good for travel, I'm going to do magic for travel, so I'm going to call this spirit while we're in this lunar mansion that relates to travel. Or you can go with Abramelin and go with the planetary zenith and say, okay, this planet is at its height at this point of the day, that's the time to call a spirit related to that planet. There's lots of different ways you can look at timing. You can look at holidays and other sorts of holy days, where is a day particularly auspicious for a spirit. So if it's a saint's feast day and you're doing magic related to that saint, then that might be a good day to do that. Or if you're doing magic with a spirit that's syncretized with that saint, then maybe you would do it on that saint's feast day. Or maybe you have a spirit that's not related to a saint, but that saint rules over something that has to do with the magic you're doing, and the spirit that you're going to work with rules over it too. So you figure that day must be auspicious for that type of task, so you're going to call the spirit at that time. Other than feast days for saints, you've got various holidays from various pagan religions. You have other holidays from Christianity and Judaism and Islam, where they're all going to have certain themes associated with them that may be more or less convenient for particular workings or particular spirits or particular goals. Say you're building up towards creating something new. Maybe you're going to work through the Sundays of Advent for that, because you're building up a process of something gestating and then coming into the world. Maybe you're trying to get rid of something in your life, so you work through Lent for that because it's a time of sacrifice and removal. You want to establish a relationship with the dead. You've got Samhain for that. You have the Dies Parentales for that. There's a handful of other feasts of the dead throughout all sorts of different religions. You can call on, you can use for that. With going back to the moon, since we've mentioned the mansions of the moon, one thing that's very popular in neo-pagan magic is the idea that you increase things along the process of leading to the full moon, you decrease things going from the full moon to the new moon, or that magic is particularly worked at the new moon or the full moon, or that certain types of magic can't be worked during a waning moon. A lot of that goes back to things that we see in the grimoires, particularly the Keys of Solomon, where certain things are put together as the moon is waxing, but not put together when the moon is waning. Spirits are called when the moon is waxing, they're not called when the moon is waning. There's other astrological considerations of where the moon can and can't be in certain texts for when you can and can't call certain types of spirits. Simpler thing that you can look at is the clock rising or is the clock falling. So if you are trying to bring something into your life or increase something, you want the clock to be rising. If you're trying to decrease something in your life, you want the clock to be falling. From the 6th position to the 12th position is rising. From the 12th position to the 6th position is falling. So it's basically the hands moving up or the hands moving down. You can break it down further to from the 6th position to 12 on the second half hour of the hour, so that both the hour and the minute hand are both rising. And that's kind of like a folk magic version of timing. Timing becomes important though because, again, time, spirits come from particular directions. Time itself is like an entity. When you look at Neoplatonism, the most primal knowable forms of divinity are associated with time. When you look in the PGM, or the Greek Magical Papyri, some of the initial invocations before you proceed with the rest of the work you're doing have to do with invoking the spirits that relate to the particular time and place that you're working. When you look at the Heptameron, which draws on some of the older grimoire magic in Europe, you have spirits associated with the season, the month, the day. In the Sefer Ratziel, Ratziel communicates to Adam the importance of understanding the division of time down to the quarter hour. And so time historically is something that has a magical component in and of itself, to the point where divisions of time often have a spiritual nature, to the point where you can consider them almost alive, if not alive, as particular spiritual forces. And so they have to be acknowledged and invoked with what you're doing as well, whether it's just observing your ritual within certain elements of time, or actually invoking the time that you're doing the ritual in, so that it comes to bear in order to strengthen your ability to work in that time. So you figured out your goal, you figured out where you're going to do your ritual, you figured out when you're going to do it. The next step, what tools are you going to use in your ritual? There are some tools that are going to be needed because they have to do with practical elements of the ritual. If you are setting up a circle, you need something to draw that circle. So you're going to need a knife or a staff or a wand or chalk or salt. Those tools are something that have to be there because it's part of how you do the thing. Some of those tools are also going to be there because it's how you set up that particular style of magic. So the circle itself is a tool. You wear a robe because that style of magic involves wearing a robe because that robe has certain symbolic meaning. You may also have things that you have to execute particular actions in the ritual. Maybe at a certain point in the ritual, you need to light a candle or you need to offer incense. So there are tools that are there because you need those tools in order to do the things that are part of the ritual. So you're going to need, if you have to offer incense at a part of the ritual, you need an incense burner, you need charcoal. So those are the tools that may be the less exciting tools to think about because they're tools that are there for practical reasons. They're tools where you can't actually perform the ritual without having those tools. You have other tools that you might need to have there because they're offerings. So is there specific stuff that your spirit likes? If you're calling upon Hecate, Hecate likes onions, eggs, fish, sweet cakes, honey. Those are things that are traditional offerings to Hecate, and so those are probably going to be the things that you're going to bring in order to offer. If you're calling on a particular issue, then you're probably going to have cigars, you're going to have some sort of alcohol, you're going to have peppers and a particular type of bread. cloth, different things that are culturally associated with that spirit, things that are particular colors because they're associated with that spirit. If you're calling upon an angel, a lot of people like to make a lot of devotional offerings to angels these days, but traditionally you'd give an angel incense. And in the greater Key of Solomon, some variants of it, you might kill an animal and give it blood. But those are your fairly typical angel offerings. All these other things that people give to angels, that's kind of a new thing. When you're figuring out what your offerings are that your spirit wants, those are going to be the things that you then have to gather. So you have to make sure you've got the liquor that you need to give. You have the blood that needs to be poured out. You've got the candles or the incense. If there's a particular thing that the spirit's going to want you to do, maybe that's something that's not a tool that you have to bring into the ritual. Maybe that's something you have to go do outside of the ritual. Or maybe there's something the spirit wants you to do in the ritual, and so you need whatever props are going to be needed in order to accomplish that. Then you're going to have tools that are based on correspondences. So if you're working in a sense where you're trying to build up a radiance that relates to that spirit, then you might pick particular colors, particular music, certain number of candles of certain colors, particular incenses, because those things are going to radiate with that spirit. So like the talisman consecration we're going to do is under the auspices of Jupiter. So we have blue candles, we have blue cloth for the altar, we have a blue disc with an orange kamea of Jupiter painted on it. We have saffron for the incense. So there are things that relate to that spirit or relate to the vibration that that spirit is associated with. So you create a space that's more comfortable for the spirit to arrive in, and where you're building up kind of a head of energy that the spirit can work with in accomplishing its goal. Then you might have other tools that are there to help facilitate spirit interaction. So are there things that are going to help the spirit arrive in the space that you're working in? Spirits have to, if they're not part of this world, then they have to break through whatever the space is between our world and their world in order to come in and interact with us. Some systems interpret that as being something that is a hot and fiery action, and so spirits need warmth in order to do that. So you might give the spirits offerings of fire. So you might burn fire burn something in a container. You might light candles. You might give the spirits alcohol, because alcohol can stir things up into a more fiery state. You might give blood. You might give certain oils or certain foods that are associated with heat and movement, because it creates that process by which the spirits can move and break through whatever it is that keeps them from being able to interact with us regularly. You might have things that are between natures. So incense is something where it's physically earthy, but you apply fire to it, it experiences the rotation of the elements and becomes arid. And so you have something that through fire is moving between elemental states, and therefore is moving between states of experience and sensation, and so that parallels that exchange and interaction between the spirit world and the physical world. Alcohol, similarly, is something that it's a liquid, but it evaporates gaseously very easily, and so it's something that is again in between and translates things from one world to another world. You might have things that provide sustenance to the spirit, so that the spirit has the energy it needs in order to come through into this world or to work in this world, or so the spirit is able to create the body that it uses in order to interact with you. And so that might be offerings of food. It might be particular foods that are associated with that spirit or with that group of spirits. It might be foods that are associated with particular experiences you want the spirit to have. When working with the dead, I will often give them honey to remind them of the sweetness of the world, wine to stir them to action, olive oil for bringing back mental acuity, and milk for physical sustenance and strength. And so you may have foods that have particular symbolism for how they provide sustenance to the spirit, or foods that have symbolism based on the type of spirit that it is. you may give them some vessel to manifest through. So one of the things that people talk about is using the incense smoke as something for the spirit to build its body out of when you're scrying. You might have a statue related to the spirit for the spirit to manifest through. You might have some particular collection of tools that relate to certain elements of the spirit's nature or the ability of the spirit to be anchored into the world, and give it some vessel that way. Tobias's creation is not particularly secret, since it was done as a public ritual. So with Tobias, he has dirt that is combined with the blood that was used in the paint for making his pact, which was also combined with the same herbs that were used for making the incense that's offered to him, which was the incense that was used in conjuring him. He has the skull because bone is something that anchors spirit. It's like a physical structural thing that can connect a spirit, and skulls in particular are something that awareness passes through, and so he's anchored to the skull. He has his actual contract, but then he also has a series of spikes which have been nailed through the names of a series of demons that are used for binding him to that space and to that jar. So you may have a vessel that is a combination of different things, because those things are used to bind that spirit into that place, or they're used to facilitate that spirit's interaction with that place. We talked about warming the spirit up so that the spirit's able to come through. There are some activities where you might not want the spirit to be warmed up and agitated, so you might offer the spirit water, or offer the spirit something else that's cooling or soothing, or something that's pleasing to the spirit, so that the spirit is in an amenable position to interact with you, or in an amenable position to go and do the work that you need to work through with it. All of that's going to depend a little bit on what the type of spirit is and how you're calling that spirit, and what its proximity to our world and our interaction is. If you've got a spirit that's already basically connected to our world, so like you're dealing with the dead, or you're dealing with the fairies, then yeah, there's a little bit of breaking through that they have to do, but not as much. So maybe you don't have to give as much to heat things up, or give as much to give them the energy to come through. But maybe if you need them to go do something, you need to give something that's more sustenance in order for them to have the energy to go do the thing that you're asking them to do, as well as then at the end giving them whatever payment it is for what you've asked for. Are there tools that you have that have connections to spirits themselves? So you might have natural things like stones or herbs or fetishes from particular animals, that those things tie back to a particular spiritual virtue, or they tie back to a particular spirit. And so you can call upon the spirit of that herb, or the spirit of that stone, or the animal spirit of whatever was used to make the tool that you're using. And those things can help facilitate the work that you're doing, facilitate your interaction with other spirits. You may also have tools that you've housed spirits in. And this isn't a practice that I particularly get into a lot, but it's a practice that a lot of your contemporary Solomonic magicians talk about, like that you might have like a ritual knife, and in the consecration of the ritual knife, there may be a spirit that's housed in that knife, and so when you work with that knife, you're working with that spirit. In the Cambridge Book of Magic and in Discovery of Witchcraft, there are examples where you call upon spirits into a crystal in a way in which you're essentially binding the spirit to that crystal, so that crystal is then always used for interacting with that spirit. So you may have tools where you've bound a particular spirit to that tool, or you might have a familiar of a spirit that is bound to that tool, so that you're more easily able to work with that spirit or the powers that that spirit controls. And then you may also have tools where they might not have a spirit bound to them, but there may have been spirits involved in working with the tool. Again, when we talk about, earlier when I was like, anyone who's read a Llewellyn book before probably also have seen things where people talk about the magic of blacksmithing, and how blacksmiths were the preservation of ancient witchcraft and pagan rituals and magic. May or may not be an historical thing, but you do have blacksmiths who work in traditional contexts where They do work with things that recognize certain natural processes or natural timings, or they do things that are a little bit secret and superstitious seeming, where maybe there is some connection to some old spiritual practice that's involved with that. Whether you're working with a smith or not, I mean, and also smithing, the idea of smithing goes back to the origins of sorcery as well. So there's definitely room for that there. But any tool that you're working on making, you've got the metal the tool's made from, the stone the tool's made from, the wood the tool's made from. You've got fire that's used in preparing it, water that's used in cleaning it, incense that's used in consecrating it. There's definitely things where you're going to interact with the making of that tool, where there's going to be spirits that you can call upon and invoke in the process of empowering the tool through its process of creation. And so if you do that as you're making your tools, then you have a way in which the tools are part of your overall spirit magic, and then you're applying that same power and that same interaction with the spirits anytime you're using that tool to work with your future goals and your future spirits. Once you've got your tools all set, you got to figure out what words you're using. So maybe you're going to have some prayers in your ritual. Do you want your prayers to be heartfelt, original prayers where you're just speaking extemporaneously? Do you want them to be things that you've pre-written, but they're still things that reflect you and your thought? Or do you want them to be these time-tested, ancient things that have been used by other magicians and other people working with these spirits and these gods over time, where you're sort of working with those other people by still using that prayer? Some of that may depend on you and your preferences. Some of it may depend on the spirit and their preferences. Some of it's also going, in terms of what you're going to say, will have to do with what your relationship is or what the interaction with that spirit is. Is it a spirit that requires deference? So are you talking to a god? Are you calling upon a saint? Are you calling upon an angel? Is it a spirit that needs a firm hand? Are you calling upon one of the aerial spirits? Are you calling upon a demon? Or is it something where you're on equal footing, like with the dead or with a fairy? You have to kind of adjust how you speak to the spirit, what references you make in talking with the spirit, based on what that spirit's culture is, based on what your interaction with the spirit is going to look like. There was one of the articles on my blog is about missing the point, and it was inspired by watching someone who was calling upon an angel, and they're like, "By my supreme power and majesty to call upon you, appear, great angel." And it's like, dude, stop trying to fucking sound like a monster, and stop sounding like you're gonna fight the angel when it gets here. Like, that's not how you talk to an angel. Like, call upon the angel respectfully, with a sense of the majesty of the divine power that is sending the angel forth to work with you. There are other spirits where maybe they don't want something so formal. The Olympic spirits, for instance, frequently tell magicians, "Don't do all this ritual stuff, just call me." Like one of them, I asked, what's the best, fastest way to call it, and it was like, "It's like a hug." And I'm like, "What?" And they're like, "Just that feeling, that sensation, that's what it's like to call me. Feel that and I'll come." And like there's some spirits that want a very informal, very personal interaction, where there's other spirits where you do need to have that, "All right, I'm summoning these things, I'm calling these things, you're going to appear this way at this time now, or else all this bad shit's going to happen." So you got to look at what the spirit is you're working with, and also how you want to work with that spirit, what relationship you want to have with that spirit, and what relationship is safe to have with that spirit. Not all spirits are friendly, not all spirits are okay, not all spirits are your bros. So some spirits you do have to take that hard line with. That's an idea that's less popular today, but you've also got to think of The spirits that don't want you to take a hard line with them maybe are the spirits that need you to take a hard line with them. And if they're the ones telling you, don't take a hard line with me, maybe that's in their interest and not in yours. What names are you going to use? Does the spirit have different names or epithets that are associated with it? If you go through the PGM, Hecate, who is like the quintessential goddess of the PGM, has dozens and dozens of different epithets that are used for her. And so depending on how you're calling upon her or what you want to interact with in terms of her nature, you might pick different epithets based on that. Does the spirit get different names in different contexts? Is there something where you can identify that this is the same spirit consistently, but when worked with in this manner, it's called this, and when worked with in that manner, it's called this? And some of that is something that you might see in the mythology of a culture or the ritual traditions of a culture. Some of that is stuff that you might have to put together from research. Has the spirit given you a name to use when calling it? Again, with the Olympic spirits, that's one of the things the Arbitel says, is that they will give you names that you can use to call them on a more familiar basis. Other spirits are said to give you special seals and possibly a name that you can use to call them so that you can dispense with the rest of the ritual procedure because you have this secret name and this secret seal that you can use to call them on a more immediate basis. Do these spirits have names that they're sworn by? So when we look at the concept of exorcism or conjuration, those two words are essentially synonyms that mean to swear an oath or to draw an oath from something, and that oath is generally sworn by a sacred name. If you're looking at spirits in a Greek context, Styx might be the sacred name that you would use to have them swear oaths by. If you are calling spirits from the Goetia of Solomon or from one of the other books of spirits that led to that, then it's the names of God that the spirits would swear oaths by. And so only certain spirits are going to be spirits where you're going to want to deal with them in that context, though, where you're going to try to bind them by an oath or bind them by a divine name. But if you're doing that, you probably want to look at the names that are going to be important to that spirit. So if I'm looking at, for example, Oberion appears in a bunch of grimoires, and you call on him and bind him by all these names of gods. But Oberion is a fairy king. So what the fuck does Oberion care about you binding him by Yahweh? So if you're looking at it in this sort of like Catholic universalizing context where it's like, okay, these people understood these fairy spirits existed and interacted with them, so okay, maybe there's these fairy spirits, but the world is Catholic, God is God, so these fairy spirits have to also exist in that Catholic world, and they have to respond to these divine names because these are the names that spirits under God are enforced by. Alternatively, you can look at it and say, the world is not necessarily Catholic, there are Catholics in the world. This spirit is a fairy, this spirit is a king amongst fairies. You could bind other fairies by his name, but what do you bind him by? Maybe you bind him by different elements of nature. Maybe you bind him by different things that are part of the world that he resides in. Maybe it's not a particular divine name, or maybe it is a divine name, but it's a divine name from the culture that he comes from. So you have to look at the context of the spirit, look at the nature of the spirit, as to whether or not you would even take that approach. But then if you're taking that approach, how do you go about doing it exactly? Whose names should you be calling them by? And then within the rest of your work, are there names or words of power that you would use that shape particular things you're working with? There's an explanation in alchemy and in other forms of mysticism derived therefrom that's described as the voice of God upon the face of the waters. It's a way of describing creation through the logos, that by speaking something that is responsive can be shaped into a thing based on the fact that speech is like a dagger that cuts something into a particular idea. So are you working with tools that would respond that way? Are you working with words of power that will shape things by naming something a thing or by calling something a thing? That's probably not something you're going to do with your particular spirits, but it may be something that you do with particular vessels for the spirit, or with ways that you're interacting with different signs or tools that are representing different goals or people that you're attempting to affect through working with these spirits. Then, once you've got all the elements of your ritual, what spirits are you calling? We talked before about, is it one spirit or is it more than one spirit? If you're using more than one, maybe it's because the world is a big, vast place and there's more than one thing that's part of what you're trying to do. Maybe it's because it's a big, vast place and there's more than one spirit that can help with the thing you're trying to do. Most things that occur are parts of complex series of interacting forces and phenomena. It's not just one little thing here that you poke that thing and okay, you got it. It's a series of structures that you have to manipulate and move things towards in order to accomplish the particular manifestation you're attempting to accomplish. And so sometimes working through those series of structures, you're going to have more than one thing that needs to put pressure in different places in order to accomplish what you're trying to get. Or it may be that you are only working with one group of spirits, but say you want to work on different levels. Say you want something that's angelic because it's going to work on trying to refine things into the best way it can be within that particular frame of reference for whatever it's ruling over. Say you're going to work with the aerial spirit because you want something that is going to deal with how stuff is manifesting and how stuff is fitting together and falling together. Say you're going to work with a demon related to that power because you want things shaken up and things changed in a way that's very material and very evident. And so all of those things working together are going to work on all the different levels of what you're trying to impact, but say you're still all working on the course of a particular ray of force, as opposed to saying, like, okay, this thing has these Jupiterian elements and solar elements and lunar elements, so I'm going to work with spirits of each. You might just be working with Jupiterian spirits on different levels because each one is going to give a different thing to how it's working on your goal. If you're working with one spirit because your goal is something that fits with that one spirit, or even if you're working with multiple spirits because your goal is connected to more than one thing, are there other spirits that you're going to work with in order to manage that work? So you might have spirits that are intermediary spirits, where they help you with communicating with the other spirits. They help give you the street cred in the spirit world to say, like, hey, this is a guy to work with, this is a guy to listen to, he's going to follow through on what he says he's going to do, or he's got the authority and power to apply in order to make you do what he wants to do if you're not going to just help him out because he asks. You might have spirit allies who are spirits that you're connected to, that you're friendly with, who are going to look out for the way that things are manifesting to make sure that it's in your interest and not something that's doing what you asked but is going to ultimately hurt you, or doing what you asked but it's going to be in a way that's really unpleasant for you. You might have things where you call upon superiors to those spirits that you're dealing with because those spirits need to be brought into line or need to be compelled in order to do the thing that you're asking. So as you're going through that, you'd have to consider, is there a god or gods that these spirits respond to? And so are you calling upon that god or gods in order to have the authority to work with those spirits, or in order to make those spirits do the things that you want? Are there gatekeepers or road openers that you need to propitiate or work with in order to have access to those spirits? Are they spirits that are already spirits that have access to this world and that you can already go talk to, or are they spirits that have to enter into this world, and so therefore you need to go to a particular gatekeeper to gain access to that spirit, or to give that spirit access to this world for it to go work? When you're working with the dead, that can be a particular thing, is most systems have something where the dead have some warden that watches over them, or they have someone that allows them in and out of the space of the dead. And so you might have to deal with that person that guards that gateway or guards that threshold between the living and the dead in order to be able to access those spirits of the dead. When you're working with demons or even with angels, you have the four kings who sort of work as gatekeepers for allowing manifestation in and out of the terrestrial world, between the terrestrial world and the spirit world. You have Hecate, who rules over the land, the sea, the sky, and the underworld. And so therefore all elements of creation are under Hecate's sway, and so are the doorways and the roads between those places. So you may have to talk with Hecate or some other spirit of the crossroads to say, I need to allow this spirit into my space and then to go out into the rest of the space in order to work on this thing that I want worked on. You may call upon your ancestors as your allies to kind of watch how the spirits are working in order to make sure that they're working in the way that you need them to work, to keep them on task, to keep them working on the task in a way that is going to be beneficial to you, because your ancestors not only understand you and understand what you want, they understand what it's like to be human, and so they understand things from a perspective that these other spirits won't necessarily understand. So they can intervene and say, hey, I get that, yes, you're building this thing that he asked for, but if you build it that way, that's going to screw up his life because he's a person. And an angel may not get that the same way that an ancestor will understand that. You might have spirits that are there to facilitate the interaction. So when you're talking to a spirit, it's not like walking up and talking to somebody that is from your town, that speaks the same way as you, that understands things the same way that you understand. You are bridging a gap of a different mode of experience and a different mode of communication. And so the way that it communicates something to you in symbols or thoughts or feelings, or even the way it speaks, may not be something that's fully evident or fully comprehensible to you. It may seem evident or comprehensible, but there may be elements of it that you're missing, or elements that aren't coming through to you correctly because of your own background and your understanding. Having some spirit that you are familiar with, that you are close to, that you're used to communicating with, who can help bridge that communication, can be useful in that regard. The Holy Guardian Angel is one of the primary spirits to use for that, or any of the personal daemon spirits that appear in the Greek magical papyri, or any of the intervening texts between the Greek magical papyri and the Abramelin. It might be your dead or your ancestors who are used to dealing with things on the spiritual world, but also used to communicating in a way that's human. But it's going to be spirits that you can either approach through divination, who you can say, I'm asking this spirit this question, what's the spirit telling me back as the answer? And you can do divination that therefore they're answering on behalf of the spirit for you. Or it might be something where you use a lamp, like we used here when conjuring a spirit based on the hygromantia, where the spirit that you're familiar with essentially shines light and clarity upon you in order to make it easier for you to scry and understand the messages from the spirit, so that you're sort of communicating with the two in tandem in that sense. It could be something where you hear the answer from the spirit, but part of that is filtered through the way in which the spirit that you're used to speaking with, or the spirit that resides with you, is speaking the answer to you for that spirit. And so there are ways in which those spirits can help translate and facilitate communication in order to make things clearer and easier to understand, because they're a spirit that you have a connection to and you have a deeper understanding of. You might have a thwarting spirit, or a spirit that is called upon in order to compel the main spirit that you're calling. This is usually going to be something that shows up when you're working with demons, or with the devils, or when you are doing compulsory magic with the dead, particularly the restless dead, or any spirit that could be adversarial to you. You might have a spirit that has authority over that spirit, or who simply has greater power than that spirit, and you call upon that spirit in order to force that spirit to arrive, in order to force the spirit to agree to whatever it is that you're asking for, and then to manage that it carries out that agreement without doing harm to you. Doesn't sound like the friendliest way of working. It's a very traditional way of working, but there are a lot of people that don't like it today because it sounds so aggressive. And then ultimately you're going to have the spirit or spirits who are going to go do the job that you want done. And so once you've identified with them and how to work with them, you can kind of figure out, based upon what your goal is and based upon what your interaction with that spirit is, what other spirits you need to bring into play. in order to create the interaction or facilitate the interaction. When you're trying to decide what type of spirit you want for the nature of your goal, you might look at, if it's like a lofty personal development goal, you're probably going to call on an angel. If it's something where it's help for you or your family on something kind of personal or simple, and simple can still be big, but like your things that are part of like day-to-day living and your human experience, then your ancestors or your saints or your mighty dead. For material gains, elemental spirits are really good at that, but also the demons or the devils, the aerial spirits, those are all good at that. If it's for knowledge, it could be any of the different classes of spirits, depending on what type of knowledge you're trying to gain and how you want that knowledge communicated to you. And depending on, again, what kind of spirit you're calling, you may or may not need more of these other spirits. If you're just talking to your ancestors, then maybe you talk to the gateway spirit and then you talk to your ancestors. You talk to the gods of the dead, your gateway spirit, and your ancestors. You don't need a thwarting spirit. You don't need more spirits to facilitate the communication. If you're talking to an angel, maybe you're going to have something to facilitate the communication. Maybe you have some spirit that's like a gateway spirit to open up the communication, but you don't need some sort of thwarting spirit. You might not need a gatekeeper spirit. You might not need a spirit to interpret for you. It's going to depend on what your facility is with working with those particular types of spirits as to what needs to be engaged, as well as what the complexity of your goal is. If your goal is something that needs very material work, then you might want more things that allow those spirits to work in the material world. If it's a goal that's more ephemeral, then you might need less with trying to draw the spirits into the physical world more fully. That is pretty much it for that. Just looking at the notes from the other class to see if there's anything that we didn't cover. I guess what your ritual might look like. So your rituals could be simple or they could be formal. Sometimes you're going to have something that is your classic Solomonic ritual where you're drawing your circle and saying your psalms and putting on your fancy clothes and your crowns and waving the sword around as you say a bunch of God names and call the spirit with these long verbose prayers, because maybe your goal needs something that's like a hammer. Maybe your goal needs something that's big in order to move around as much as possible. There's other times where maybe your goal is something that doesn't need all that. Maybe it's something simple and small, and you just have to have a conversation with the spirit. Sometimes it might not be your goal. Sometimes it might be what your relationship with that spirit is. If it's a spirit that you work with regularly and that you have a fairly familiar engagement with, where you can call upon the spirit by name and seal and not having to use a whole big conjuration ritual, or where it's a spirit that is a neighboring spirit and so you can call upon it by going into its space or by just calling out for it, then maybe it's just sitting down and talking with the spirit about what your needs are or what's going on in your life, and that's all you need to do. Kind of talked about all of that. So yeah, a lot of what we cut out of the first class is in the second class, so we pretty much covered all of that material too. And so that is pretty much it for how to go around living in this world full of spirits. If you have questions or want more info, there's obviously the book, but I can also answer questions right now since I'm sitting here. So were there any questions people had? Yes.
Well, again, this is a technical question, and I have a bunch of them, but I guess one of the things that always kind of trips me up is all the preparation that goes into, or feeling like there's a lot of preparation that needs to go into, making a conjuration, making the invocation, making the evocation beforehand. And that's the consecration of all the, tools, and, also just preparing in other ways. But I just kind of noticed that you haven't been eating a lot, and I kind of thought about this in the morning, like, what kind of importance do you sort of place on doing things like fasting?
Okay, so that is actually a really good question. So When I was younger, like college age, I did a lot of fasting in the sense of like just sort of developing willpower and focus, and probably just had like some mental issues that were going on there. But the I don't do a ton of the fasting and abstinence in most of the spirit work that I deal with, but a lot of my spirit work is dealing with the dead, and so it's not as much of an issue there. With angels, sometimes I will do those things, but not always. And some of that's because like I've established relationships with them, and so if you have that established relationship, you don't need as much of that. I think a lot of people interpret it as like the spirits won't want to work with you unless you have fasted and purified yourself, because the spirits find humans to be filthy and disgusting, and don't want to deal with our smells and our human natures. And while, yeah, there's some element of that in some religious texts that suggest that, let's break that apart a little bit. So, I think it was, no, maybe it wasn't Jake. I don't know who said it. Somebody pointed out that if you're in a temple in Egypt in 500 BCE, doesn't matter how much incense you're burning or what oils you're rubbing on yourself, you probably still smell bad, because it's just hot as balls, and you're in a temple that is closed off and doesn't have good ventilation, and you've been doing like rituals all day in this space. When you look at the books of Enoch, Enoch is the holiest person in all the world. He's God's favorite and is the only person God is willing to pull into heaven. First thing the angels say, dude, gross, it smells like semen in here. Why did you bring that creature in that smells like semen? So even being the holiest person on earth did not absolve Enoch from getting that response from the angels. So if you're dealing with that context where spirits find humans to be gross because we have physical bodies, then nothing we do is going to get rid of that. You're not going to get rid of like those human scents and human elements that angels don't like because of our physicality. I think if you look at Yuval Harari, who did a translation of the Sword of Moses, and he also wrote a book recently on Jewish magic before the Kabbalah. In his introduction to the Sword of Moses translation, he talks about how God is the God of magic, and so magic is sanctioned by God. So the angels will participate with humans in magic because that's part of their job. It's part of who they are. It's part of what God has ordained for us. Yuval Harari. He wrote *Sapiens*. He's most famous for writing *Sapiens*. So if you search for *Sapiens*, you'll be able to find him. Which is not a magic book at all. But I think if you look at Hermetic context, if you look at a lot, even within a Christian context, a lot of the idea that really kind of comes into play in terms of man being able to interact with angels is this idea that man is made in God's image, and so the angels love the divine image. They love God. And so working with man is an extension of that. The idea that angels hate man and don't want anything to do with man's grossness, that's something that you see in the apocryphal sources that are taking that idea of the fall from heaven and angels rebelling against God. And those get like really complicated and bizarre, where you might have the same angels that are telling God that humans are horrible and need to be punished are the angels that are teaching humans bad things to do that make God mad, and then those angels get punished in the process anyway. So I think that's an interesting model for a story, but I think in my experience, angels love people, and that's part of that whole be your best self thing that they're always driving, is they want to see you actualizing that likeness to God as much as possible. They don't want to see you being the schlub who's flopping about, doing whatever and wasting your life. So That's what they want more than for you to not eat meat or beans and to bathe for 9 days in water up to your neck because they don't want to smell you. The what I have found to be the case. I did the Abramelin working based on the German version blended with the Crowley Liber 8 process, and then drawing on some Catholic mysticism and some Merkabah mysticism. And so that's a process that takes months, and so there's lots of preparation. But in the end, you really have like the beginning of your major process where you're doing your confessions. There's ritual elements to that, and then there's the end where you're calling on the angel and you're binding the demons. There's ritual elements to that. The rest of it's not really ritual, it's just preparation. And so it's just prayer and reflection while fasting and abstaining. And once while hanging out with the Brodepti, we were talking about it, and I was like, the only thing that I have had that comes close to the type of visionary experience that the Abramelin produced is when I was a teenager and I was reading books on shamanism, and I was trying to work with stuff like that where I would like drum on rocks and fast and deprive myself of sleep in order to create altered states of consciousness in order to connect to spiritual worlds. The Abramelin was like that experience times 10. And in talking about that, I realized that it's the same idea. You're going through months of prayer and reflection, months of eliminating certain things from your diet, eliminating things from your behavior, and doing all these like meditative activities to the point where you're constantly revving up this altered state of awareness and altered state of consciousness, and then you put yourself into this ritual space and you open yourself up to these spiritual beings, and everything is super vivid and immense because you've built an awareness that allows yourself to engage that space more fully. And so I think a lot of the preparations that you have to do in the grimoires, yes, there's an element of it that has to do with purity, because it's like if you're doing an exorcism in like the modern Catholic sense, you go to confession and you take the Eucharist before doing it because you don't want to be in a state where you're easily manipulated by the demons. So there's that removal of miasma, there's that removal of things that distract you and impair you from understanding what you're doing. But when you're doing that level of purification, you're removing distractions so intensely that all that's left for you to be aware of is that spiritual reality. And so, yes, it's purifying because it's removing things that distract you and prevent you from engaging that spiritual reality, but it's about opening up the doorways to that awareness more than it is about making angels okay with you. And I've done conjurations from grimoires where I have done days and days of preparation beforehand in terms of building up the tools and doing prayers and doing purifications, and they work. But I've also done conjurations where I've pulled out a book or printed something off and gone and done the conjuration. I've done conjurations at my desk at work, and they work. And so now if I'm doing something that's like a quick off thing like that, probably not seeing the spirit, probably not engaging in as full a way because I'm distracted. I'm not fully immersed into it. But I don't think it's a matter of the spirits are only willing to respond on that level if you do these things. I think it's you're preparing yourself to be able to engage on that level by doing those things. Any other questions?
I'm still trying to come up with the terminology for it, but it's like the internal environment of our psyche, where we have predispositions to certain types of spirits.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I know I brought this up to you before, and a couple of people at the lodges. For some reason, I feel like I'm more of an ancestral bond with high-level celestials and infernals than I do my actual ancestor spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And as well as certain pantheons of gods. So, do you think like that is like something custom to my own like spiritual psyche, or and for anybody like they may mesh said gods and whatnot.
Mhm.
Do you think that's a big portion of something that's custom made for them in their spiritual mechanics? And how does that interact with how they interact with the spirit world?
That's something I've not really tried to formulate an answer on, because you get a lot of different ideas about that. Where you start getting into like the things where it's like, okay, people of certain descent can connect with these spirits, and people of other descent can't. And it's also where you start to get into things of like, are you connecting with the spirit because the spirit's calling you, or are you connecting with the spirit because you're attracted to that spirit? And it's really hard to define those things. I think for the average person, my leaning would be that there will be some element of, there's certain cultures, certain spirits that you are drawn to naturally because of whatever your spiritual history is. And then there's going to be other ones that you're drawn to because it's almost like fashion. Like there's things where you've seen certain things over your life and certain things have shaped you, and so there's certain preferences that you like and certain aesthetic things that are a draw to you, and so certain things will seem or feel better than other things, and so that can define what that draw is just as much as anything innate to you. And I don't think it's always important to understand the difference between the two, because if you are drawn to something and it's fulfilling you and you're working it correctly and working it in a way that's real and it's accomplishing things, then does it matter if you like it because the way you grew up taught you to like it, or does it matter if you like it because the way you were born defined that you would like it? I don't think it matters too much in the end, as long as it's something where whatever you're doing is real and it's natural to you, and it's not something where you're allowing it to build up a structure that is allowing you to be distracted from whatever the reality of the thing is. Anybody else? Any other side of the room? Okay.
UFOs as possible physical manifestations of all of these spirits that we addressed.
That is why I will probably never be on an episode of Rune Soup, as I can't get into the whole UFO thing. No. I've never been a UFOs as an alternate way of understanding gods or spirits person. Like, I think the universe is vast, and so there's no reason to assume that there's not other life. And I would think that other life would be life that's just like us in a spiritual sense, that like, not that they're going to be identical to us, or they're going to look like us, or they're going to have cultures or lives like ours, but that they're not going to be something that is on a higher plane spiritually than us. And I don't necessarily think that other life either comes to Earth or doesn't come to Earth, or has a reason to be interested in us or a reason to not be interested in us. Those are just questions that aren't important to me. But I assume if there are aliens, they're just aliens. They're not the same as spirits or the same as gods. Now, if the question is more that, are UFOs a way that people have contextualized and culturally understood different spirit experiences, because we no longer have a vocabulary for describing spirit experiences, but we have a vocabulary for describing extraterrestrial experiences? That can be interesting. It's not something I've put time into looking at, but I think it's possible. I think Gordon White and some of the people that he's talked to have made some interesting comparisons between fairy stories and alien abduction stories, particularly when you look at consistent elements of food and the types of food that fairies offer and the types of food that aliens offer, and how that food impacts the relationship between the person who's abducted and the abductee. Those things seem to parallel very closely in some UFO stories as to what they would have in certain fairy-led stories. The life of a person who returns from being fairy-led and the life of a person who returns from an abductee experience, there's parallels in those things. So yeah, it could be that stuff happens where these beings appear and they're spiritual beings, and people are like, oh shit, what is this? It must be an alien. I'm on a UFO. Or conversely, maybe it's always been aliens and UFOs, and we've just been like, oh shit, fairies. I definitely would be more the former than the latter if I was going to say that they overlapped. It's probably spirits, and we just think they're aliens, rather than they're aliens and we think they're spirits. Because if they were just aliens, I'm sure like they'd have a more concrete way of dealing with us over time, thousands of years. But yeah, it's not a question I put a lot of time into or a lot of thought into. But I think if that's the question, is it possible that they're the same phenomenon described in different ways? Yes, it could be. But I don't know for sure. But the truth is out there.
More into spirits.
Yeah.
Chief X-Files theme.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, I guess that wraps this up, and then we have a ritual to do.